Hey folks, we are here at Build Conference. I am Dan Fernandez and I'm talking to some of our dear friends. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, but really our topic today is Docker and some of our developer tooling we're doing both from Docker team and from Visual Studio. So we'll go this way. Steve, why don't you quickly introduce, what would you say you do here?
I work on enabling developers to use Docker in Visual Studio and our developer tools. So
Okay.
I'm a program manager and work on things like Visual Studio tools for Docker, Visual Studio Code, Docker, and some other stuff that we're doing.
Awesome.
My name is Michael Friss. I'm a product manager at Docker. I kind of try to keep tracks of all things Microsoft. So that's both making Docker work on Windows Server, on Azure, and making sure that .NET is a great experience with Docker.
Okay.
Hey Dan, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Patrick.
So I'm Patrick Chanazon, I'm an ex-Microsoft guy, and I've been at Docker for a year. I'm a member of technical staff, and I work directly with Solomon Heights, a Docker founder, to build the Docker platform.
Awesome, awesome. So, a lot of, we saw Docker mentioned in the keynote, microservices mentioned in the keynote a number of times. What are some of the key announcements and capabilities that have kind of come out at Build for developers around Docker?
Well, we've been working on a pretty iterative thing, actually. So there's, from a news point, we have Service Fabric, which we're talking about with containers as well. From a developer tooling that we've been working on, there's the Visual Studio tools for developers, where we're adding breakpoint debugging, so giving you the same experience that you would expect. If you're building ASP.NET running locally, you really like that. Hit F5, things start running, and I get my breakpoints, and I can make those changes. So that's some of the new stuff that we've been adding based on feedback. And
awesome.
The big thing, I guess, is the stuff that the Docker folks have been working on to make working with Docker locally much easier. We've all, I'll set them up. We've all struggled with VirtualBox, which wasn't really there as they shipped it so they can use the Docker APIs, and it has probably been one of the biggest frustrations for developers getting things working. And you have to disable Hyper-V, which you probably have VMs running, or you're using more emulators, and you can't do that because you have other tasks. So they've been working on a new Docker.
Yeah, so
Docker
let's talk about it. What exactly did you all release? Because this was relatively recently, but just before the Build conference.
Yeah, so last week we announced Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows beta. So as you know, Docker's mission is to build tools of mass innovation. One of the innovations that we brought to the world is that developer workflow that's based on that notion of Docker containers. Docker containers originate into Linux technology, so they're a nice way to package your application using Linux kernel features, namespaces, and C groups. And so that means you need a Linux VM on your machine in order to leverage containers today.
Right.
In the future, Microsoft is working with Windows Server 2016 to bring that goodness to Windows. But for now, developers are building essentially Linux applications packaged as containers, and that's a great way to build microservice-based apps. And so in order to make that workflow easier for people who are using Mac and Windows, what we did is that we released a private beta version, so there's a waiting list, but you can sign up at beta.docker.com.
That's beta.docker.com.
Yeah, beta.docker.com. You can sign up today, and it's an awesome, super easy version of Docker to work with Linux containers on Mac and on Windows.
Okay.
And the way it works is, as Steve said, many developers who are not on Linux and started using Docker on Mac and Windows have been using our tools that are called Toolbox. And Toolbox is leveraging a virtual machine that's called VirtualBox that's coming from Oracle. And there are lots of issues with that. The workflow is kind of clumsy. There are some things that don't work out. There's a little bit of setup to do before you get started. So there's too much of what we developers call yak shaving. Okay. And we just want to get rid of that. So with Docker for Mac and Windows, you get native applications that you download, just install them on your machine, and they leverage the native virtualization capabilities of the platform. So on Mac, we're using the hypervisor framework that Apple introduced in Yosemite. And on top of that, we're running a project called Xhive that we modified pretty heavily to really integrate with the Mac networking and file system management systems.
Okay.
And so the result is that you're installing an application, and once it's running, you have a toolbar, and you can see the status of your Docker engine. The same thing happens on Windows. You just install a native Windows app. You have a tray menu with a little whale icon that shows you that Docker is running. And then you just open a terminal and you just do a Docker PS, Docker info, or you can start running container right away. Behind the scenes on Windows, it's using Hyper-V, which is the native virtualization for Windows.
Right, right.
And so it's much more efficient. It's using Samba for mounting volumes and giving you access to all your C drive. So it really makes it's the best way and the easiest way to use Docker on Mac and Windows.
So, and things that are included, you get the Docker, like in terms of the client, the Docker CLI.
Yes.
Docker Compose. Now, is Docker Machine also included for spinning up as part of that install?
So Docker Machine, I think, is part of the install. Yeah, it is part of the install.
The Docker Machine is on the install. So the way it works with Docker for Mac and Windows is with Toolbox, you used to also use Docker Machine to manage both the local VMs that you had for development, but also any remote VMs that you wanted to spin up on Azure or other places. Because the provisioning of the local Linux VM with Docker for Windows and Docker for Mac is kind of integrated, and we basically handle all of that.
Okay.
Docker Machine is still in the install, but it's not appropriate for creating more local machines. But you can still use it to create remote machines if you want to debug remotely, or you can have a big thing you want to test, and it doesn't really fit on your local machine.
Okay, and you were talking about some of the investments we were making in Docker Machine on Azure specifically to make. What are some of the key things there?
Yeah, so today, because it's coming in the next release of Docker Toolbox. If you're provisioning something in Azure, Docker host, there's the Docker Machine-create API. And there's an Azure driver for it. But it was a little dated. We hadn't updated it up until recently. And it was pretty difficult. You had to manually create certs with SSH, which of course we don't really have very easily.
Right.
You had to upload it to the portal. You had to copy it to the right places. And it was just a big stumbling
Just setup
block.
was really hard.
It was really
Sure.
hard. In fact, we had some tools in Visual Studio to try to make it easier.
Right.
And even that was really hard for us because now we're shipping all these different libraries. So what we've been doing is through the open source project, Amit, one of our developers on our team, has been working with the guys and contributed a new Azure driver that all you do is say Azure, Docker Machine create, provide the driver, you log in to Azure through the Azure CLI, and you're done. It'll create the certs for you, it'll upload it, it'll get a management cert, it'll put the certs, all that stuff. It's funny because I'm a Windows guy. The first time I've used Linux, I like Donovan Brown mentioned this morning, was being at Microsoft.
Oh yeah.
So I'm learning Linux and all these things that I know they're all used to certs everywhere. And apparently we have them in Windows also, but we never see them because it's handled for us under the covers.
Right, right.
So we're getting around to doing that for all of these tools as well. So all the cert stuff is transparent to the developers now.
Awesome.
And that'll be coming in the 0.7.0 release. So fairly shortly, you'll be able to get Docker Machine. And to what Michael was talking about, I think the positioning is you take Docker Toolbox today to get all the CLIs from Docker. You'll get Docker for Windows, and it'll have those same CLIs. Even though you don't use Docker Machine to work with the local experience, you still want Docker Machine to be able to work with your remote containers.
Right. So in case you need to set up, 20 hosts or something ridiculous, it's that easy, and it's sort of that consistent CLI experience. You can script it, all that wonderful stuff you want.
And the new one works in ARM, so it creates a V2 VM, so you can get to it in the current portal.
Right.
You can set up files. The best part about it is you don't have to go to the portal to configure ports. You just pass. I could do a whole thing on Docker Machine. Amit did an awesome job.
Yeah,
so now you just
which
pass
is
the
a shout out
ports
to
when
Amit
open.
Altbakken,
Yes.
who's also one of the key contributors for the Docker CLI. So,
Yep.
so go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted to say Ahmed did a really good job with the new driver.
Right.
I've been using Docker Machine for a long time, especially in Azure with the Azure driver. What's really nice with the new driver is that it adds some options, for example, to open some of the ports.
And you can give
Right.
them
And
a list of ports. It's
And
awesome.
it makes it super easy, for example, to create Swarm clusters on Azure now using just Docker Machine commands. So that's...
So tell me about some of the Swarm cluster capabilities. So what does that mean? And
Yes.
because there's a number of ways to build Swarm clusters,
Yeah.
right? I can have a simple text file that basically says, these are the ones that are going to be within my machine. How does this make it easier?
Yeah, so it makes it easier where in order to create a Swarm cluster, you need to provision several VMs. They need to have some ports open. They need to have security set up. And then on top of that, you need to install Docker engine, and then you install Swarm, and some will be master and some will be nodes. With a new Docker machine, it's really easy to just, and Docker machine is integrated with Swarm, so there are some options where you can say, oh, this node will be a master, and these nodes are going to be slaves, and I want to add labels to stop them and all that. So all these options are now in the Docker machine Azure driver, and it makes it super easy as a developer to create a small Swarm cluster just for development, test, and QA.
Sure.
If you want to create a cluster in Azure for production, you have several other options. One of the options is Azure Container Service.
Right.
That lets you provision either a Swarm cluster or a Mesos cluster, and then it's managed by Azure. There are also some templates that you can use, Azure Resource Management templates.
And those are all open source on GitHub too, and you can basically say how many agents you want to spin up, and it really is that easy.
Yeah, and it's using some of the features that Scott talked about this morning in the keynote, which is VM scale sets.
Right.
Yeah, so that excites me a lot. I think VM scale set plus Docker Swarm is going to be like awesome for ops, people who are managing large clusters at scale.
So one of the cool things, getting back to some of the Visual Studio tooling, is the support for Docker Compose, because it just makes it that much easier to target a Swarm cluster. Maybe talk about some of the key things we're doing from Visual Studio. You're an ASP.NET developer. I want my thing, whether it's on a Swarm cluster, one machine, or hundreds. What investments are we doing there?
Yeah, so you start with the hello world, and you have a single app, and you've got a single website, and that's fine. But very quickly you start to need more. You need a cache. You might need a database. You might need an API. And with the microservice model, you have a bunch of these different containers that you're building, and you have different projects. So very quickly you go from, I don't want to just test this one project. I want to test multiples. So one of the things that we've done is, in the evolutions of the tools, is instead of just having a single Docker file in the project, we'll give you a Docker Compose file. So you can specify in there, and we'll give you, obviously, the Compose file with your single project, but you just start adding the other services. And it could be an image that it's already compiled, or it could be another project with another Docker file, so that now you can start debugging and developing locally that swarm of containers, I guess, a collection of containers, and they could be running locally. Or you might run them in Azure. You might be running and doing your debugging into containers running in Azure.
Or a pre-prod environment in Azure, for sure. Or
pre-prod, or dev test labs, some of the other features that we have. But the Compose file is a great way of being able to define the collection of containers and how they interact. So it's a great developer experience, and we give you both a debug and a release version of each, because in the debug version we do the volume mapping, which works beautifully with Docker for Windows now, so that I can actually spin my container up, make a file change, save it, and it's already running in the container because we're doing the volume mapping.
Right.
But in release, in your release mode, you don't want volume mapping, in your production to your source files on your laptop.
Right,
So
and this is probably one of the key points of Docker is in that, quote, release version, I can take that container and run it on anything. So if I need to target on-prem, if I need to target any number of clouds, I can easily take that ASP.NET app, all its dependencies, everything is in that image, and I just Docker run it, right?
Yep. And Docker is really a great contract for developers communicating with QA, test, ops. You create a container image locally, you test it, make sure it works in release mode, and you can ship that to QA, test, production, and it comes with all the stuff that's required to make that run. So you kind of get rid of that problem where you have to tell a whole bunch of people how to set up their machines to actually run this code, and especially tell your ops team that they need to log into the server first before deploying this version.
Copy these DLLs, rename this directory, set these permissions.
Exactly.
Just get Service Pack 22 with the hotfix.
Yeah, all that.
It works on my machine. I don't know what's wrong with you guys. Jeez.
Exactly. So one of the goals of Docker was to avoid that problem of it works on my machine and then in ops it doesn't work. The thing that you're running in production is actually exactly the thing that the developers built. And we actually built some additional tooling in Docker to make sure that that works in a production workflow. It's called Docker Content Trust, and it lets developers sign their images with a certificate that has been issued by their apps. And then on the upside, they can revoke certificates and they can check that what's running is really what they said should be running in their cluster. So there's that control aspect for apps that's super important. The portability aspect is really at the heart of Docker. But I'd say for developers, what Docker really brings to them is that agility, a new level of agility for something that we call in-container development. In the past, and I'm sure many of you have been bitten by that, where
you're looking right at me, so probably me. Yes,
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, when you were working on different applications using different versions of frameworks for .NET, for Node, for Ruby, and all that, you needed to do a lot of yacht shaving and installation on your local machine, which became really complicated to manage. Now, with the new Docker for Mac and Docker for Windows, with volumes working really well, you can do what we call in-container development, which means that for developing an application, the only thing you need is a Git, an editor or IDE, and Docker. And then all your dependencies run in the container. So you can just specify everything in the Docker file and the compose file, and then it's just a Docker compose app.
Yeah.
So in some ways, Docker shipping the Linux container environment to Windows makes it possible to develop, seamlessly develop Ruby apps, Node apps, and Python, like frameworks and languages that I think you guys are doing a good job now helping those communities make their stuff run well on Windows.
It's okay. I'll take the knife out later.
But because Docker can ship a fully functioning Python or Ruby container to your machine without you having to install that and make it work with all the paths and stuff on Windows, it just makes it way easier.
So, and this is kind of another good point, which is a number of our developers are actually on Mac, and we have some great tools for Visual Studio Code, and our team services, which again works cross-platform. So maybe you could give some of the
services stuff,
DevOps and for Mac and Linux developers, Visual Studio Code.
Yeah. So regardless of whether you're starting on the client, you're working with Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code on the Mac, you want to be able to do that, get your development in. But to your point, you don't deploy code; you're deploying images. So in Visual Studio Team Systems, one of the things that we released this week is a preview for team system build steps for Docker, that you can build your images, and then you're deploying images to the various container services. So I know we're wrapping up.
So so we got Visual Studio Preview, Visual Studio Code, Docker for Mac. Definitely check it out. We'll post the links for all this stuff for you all to play. And thank you all. Thank you for my guests. This has been awesome. Really appreciate it, guys. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.